The Secret Life of Vineyards. What would surprise you about what happens during each season in the vineyard and how that changes the wine you drink? And why are bats, sheep, and pigs roaming around between the vines of more and more vineyards? Well, tonight you're going to get those stories and insider tips and more. Now, if you're watching this video on the replay, please, in the comments, type the word replay. I want to hear from you. What city are you logging in from? What's the weather like? And of course, if you're here with me live, I want you to jump in there too. What's in your glass? Where are you from? I'm Natalie McLean, and I teach online wine and food pairing classes, and you've just joined one of the most passionate groups of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine, like my guest, whom I'll introduce momentarily. Now, this video is based on a recording I made for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk, but I'm going to be here live in the comments, so get in there. Let me know what stories you're enjoying, what questions you still have, because I'll be responding, as they say, in real time to your comments. Before I introduce our guest, let me say that 3 of you are going to win a copy of her terrific new book, A Year in the Vineyard. It's just gorgeous. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com and let me know you want to win a copy. I'll choose 3 people randomly from those who contact me. So back to our guest. Sophie Menin is a journalist who has contributed to the New York Times, Barron's, Wine Spectator, Savour, and many other publications. Her wine writing focuses on the myriad ways that wine connects us with our senses and to the rhythms of the natural world. Love that. Her writing can be found in her online journal, lifewithwine.com. She and Bob Chaplin are the co-authors of the splendid new book, A Year in the Vineyard. She earned a Master of Arts in Cultural Reporting and Criticism from the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at New York University and a professional degree in the Culinary Arts from the Institute of Culinary Education. And Sophie joins us now from her home in New York. Welcome, Sophie. We're so glad you're here with us.
Thank you for having me. It's really an honor.
Thank you. That's great. All right, so let's dive in. Before we get to the book, I'm curious, as a writer, what was the exact moment you decided you wanted to become a writer? Tell us about that.
It was very young. I was in high school, and I took AP Art History, and it was the first time I learned about the world through the way people express themselves instead of through wars and treaties. And I knew in some way or another I wanted to live like that, but I can't paint. I can't sing. I don't play an instrument. But I was always a very good writer, and I just stayed with that path and kept choosing that path. I think it's something you have to keep choosing throughout your life.
That's true. Every day it's like, I've got to keep going here. As they say, the secret to writing is AC, ass in chair, forgive my vulgarity. Yeah. But yeah, it's true. Yeah. Very much. So take us to the worst moment of your writing career. We'll get to the happy one next, but what was it? What would you describe as the worst moment?
Oh, that's a really good question, and probably one I don't like to think about.
Yes.
But I remember it well because I was a young journalist, and I got an assignment from a paper I had always dreamed of writing for, but I was a stringer, so I wasn't inside the newsroom. And they changed the lead on my piece before it went to print. Ooh. And they showed it to me at the 11th hour. And I was too chicken to pull it, but it wasn't what I wanted to write. And I cried for weeks after it was published. It just did not represent what I wanted to say. Wow. And I really vowed to myself that I would never let that happen again, that I would make it their problem. No matter what publication it was, I would pull my piece. That you do have power and agency, and if it's your piece, you can say no, no matter how much you want to work with someplace, if it was a dream or something like that. Like you have to say no if it's your name.
Absolutely. Yeah, your name is all you have when you're a writer. I mean, it's so precarious these days, but that's a great lesson to draw from that. Yeah, wow. And now let's give it a happy ending.
Thank you.
That's what I do. I just take us to the best moment where you live happily ever after.
I have to tell you, receiving the advanced copy of my book was one of the best moments because I'm so proud of it. It's a complete thought. And in this case, my publisher went above. Do you mind if I show it?
Oh, please, you got to. Throughout this conversation, please. And for those listening, we'll put a link to the book in the show notes.
Above and beyond, just in the quality of the publishing.
It's beautiful.
In every page, in every, just every detail. They gave us a lot of creative freedom. And
look at those pictures, full color pictures. Oh my goodness, hardcover.
On every page, hardcover. Just
beautiful.
It's printed in Italy. They just did the most beautiful job. Yeah. And
yeah.
So,
it'd be a beautiful coffee table book, but
definitely.
Don't just leave it on the coffee table, folks. Sophie is a beautiful writer, so you're going to want to actually read this book, and we're going to get to that. But well done. That's beautiful. What do you think you'd be doing professionally if you weren't writing?
I think I'd be a teacher.
Oh, really? Why's that?
You know, I'm on the board of the Women's Media Group, and I head the scholarship committee, and I organize mentors, and I love mentoring young writers and helping people really begin to think independently. I love ghostwriting to help people get their stories down. You know, so that process, as time goes on, is really important to me and something I engage in, and I think teaching's so important. You know, raising a daughter, you really realize that your teachers are your partners. Her teachers were our partner in raising her and cultivating her mind.
Absolutely. As the daughter of a school teacher, she taught elementary school for 32 years. I have to say, amen to that. She had profound impact, and she still hears from students. I wasn't a school teacher, but I still hear from the students I taught dancing. And I see them out in the world, and they connect on Facebook, and they have children, and it's amazing, the ripple effect. Yeah, absolutely. Here's to school teachers. So what was the moment when you decided to write A Year in the Vineyard? Where were you? What triggered the idea?
I had a column with the Daily Beast very early on, and it was called 100 Summer Nights, and it was about summer meals all around the globe, and these kind of special meals that you have when the weather's warm and there's more light. And as part of that, I was tracing the activity in the vineyard at Olivier Leflevre, and that was the part of
Burgundian.
That was the part of the series that captured my imagination. And this is before Instagram was so popular, you know, so this really moment by moment watching the vineyard was just so fascinating to me, and I wanted to document, you know, really I thought just that summer period. Originally the book was called 100 Summer Nights, but as we dug into it, you know, that's just the most kind of spectacular moment, that every season in the vineyard is equally important. That's just when the show goes on, in a sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. And what was your favorite memorable moment at Olivier Leflevre, which is like one of the top tier producers in Burgundy, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and so on? Yeah.
You know, I've never been there. I suffer from extreme empathy, so I can interview somebody and talk to them about it. But listening to him talk about standing at his vineyard and looking at the different sites and being able to see the difference between Chassagne and Marceau, and you know that's just, it was so particular, and then also how fragile these moments are. That you know, wine growing is a nail biter experience when you really dig in. And that, so it was June, and it was about the flowering and how that can determine the whole year depending on the weather. If they want a warm, dry June for an even flowering, so you have even ripening and an even harvest. If you get a lot of rain at that point, you know, it impacts the whole growing season. And that was just fascinating, that you don't think about that moment being so fragile.
Yes. Wow. Yeah, it's so powerful the way, again, it'll ripple through everything that comes next. So the title is self-explanatory, A Year in the Vineyard, and I like that you first thought of 100 Nights, but tell us what makes this book different from other books that people might think are similar. I mean, it's gorgeous, and we, as I say, we'll put a link in the show notes to those who are for those who are listening, but what else makes this book different, Sophie?
Well, first, I'm a wine writer, but I have my co-author is a really extraordinary human being. Bob Chaplin is an environmental artist. His work is in the British Museum, it's in the Whitney, it's in MoMA, it's in the Victoria Albert, and he does what you call garden installations and looks at plants over time in different kinds of situations. And so he was for a time the wine writer for the Hartford Courant, and we met on we met at Merlot Camp. It was a press trip in
Merlot Camp. That sounds tough.
It was really tough.
Were you just kids?
Exactly. Right. And so I had this idea for this book, but I wanted to do it very visually and didn't have the skill sets to do the visual piece. And then when I found out that he was also an artisanal bookmaker, this kind of our collaboration, because on every page there's text that I write and he edits. There's photographs that were mostly given to us by Vineyards, but then some were taken by Bob, some were even taken by me, and then there were a couple of photographers who were very important to the book. And then there are these scans of paintings, background paintings from Bob's art that he manipulated to so the story is told in photographs and in text, and then also in the color and texture of these background paintings that really makes it a very sensual journey through the seasons. And so so that's one thing, it's the collaboration. And then we're not focused on a single vineyard or even a single region. We have included vineyards from around the globe. We have first growth Bordeaux, we have natural winemakers, and we have corporate wineries and family wineries and wineries that function like art projects. But we wanted to link them because everybody's in this same conversation with the cycle of the vine, but then very specific to their goals and to where they're growing the wine.
That's fascinating. And how did you end up choosing? I mean, obviously you wanted a broad cross-section, but how did you actually say, okay, these are the wineries that are going to be in the book?
You know, some of them is, I was a journeyman wine writer for a long time, stringing for a lot of different publications, and so you collect stories. And so you have the wineries where you have stories, and then I collected these kinds of stories along the way. So there was that piece, and I'm lucky enough to live in New York City, which means that winery owners come through all the time, and so you have a chance to meet and talk. And so some of it were relationships, some of it was dream, like, oh, I really want to show Coulara pruning from Santorini, because I love the way the baskets sit close to the earth and protect the fruit from the heat and the wind on that island. And so, you just write them a note, and it's one of those things when you have a number of wineries that they admire, that are their peers, they're more likely to speak with you. And so it grew and grew. And so we're very lucky.
Yeah, very organic project as well.
Without a doubt.
What's the most surprising thing that you discovered while you were either researching or writing the book?
One of them was that that more than half of the vineyard crew at Chateau Yquem is over 60 years old.
Really?
That they've worked there for their entire lives, many of them, and that they have this fantastic kind of institutional knowledge of the different patterns of grape ripeness and botrytis. And so when you think about
noble rot, just for those who might not be aware, but it infects the grapes, so to speak, but it's also responsible for the magnificent wines of Chateau Yquem, the sweet dessert wines. Yeah.
Right. What makes it dangerous some places and very special there is that they have this very special location between two water bodies, so it's very humid every morning, so so that the rot begins to develop. But then sits on top of a hill, so the winds come in and dry it. So they only get the concentration without the degradation. So it's very special and very unique to Sauternes in general and Chateau Yquem in particular. So, right, you think about harvesting always being this kind of brawny, thing for very young people or people, but it's very, and that's actually, now that I'm talking, I'm thinking more clearly, vineyard work is such skilled labor throughout. It is such skilled labor. And this is one example of it being skilled labor, but time and time again, like it was really impressed upon how important vineyard workers are and what skilled laborers they really are.
That's amazing. And they must treat them well, obviously, to keep the vineyard workers, because we also think we have biases, maybe prejudices of vineyard workers, A, being unskilled, and B, being imported from another country because the wages are so low. But these people at Chateau Yquem and probably many other wineries, especially your top wines, they're coming back year after year. There has to be something keeping them there in terms of the way they're treated and paid and valued for their skills.
That's right. And it's not just at Chateau Yquem. It would be places you would be surprised about, places that look like large, more corporate wineries like Esparrejo in Portugal, where part of their move towards organics and biodynamics and regenerative agriculture has to do with their people policy and giving their vineyard workers the same benefits as their office workers. And we're seeing that in more and more places. Bonterra out in Mendocino. I mean, it's really become a very important part, the people part, and who really makes the wine. If you believe, like I do, that wine is made in the vineyard, as much as it's made in the cellar, it's becoming an important part of high quality at every price point viticulture, definitely.
Absolutely. What's the most interesting thing someone has said about the book so far? I know it's just new out, but...
I was very happy when I just have a couple advanced copies, when I showed it to somebody who I didn't know, that she quickly leafed through it, and I think because she's a gardener, she understood what it was about exactly, and she understood about the climate adaptations, and she just got it. And you always wonder if somebody who would be your audience is going to understand what you were trying to do. So to have somebody so new to the project just get it was really heartening for me.
That's great. It's great. And the most difficult part about writing the book?
The most difficult part about writing this book is, even though it's so beautifully published and the photography is so magnificent, we were very dependent on outside sources for this. We really did this on a budget. And so it was a puzzle. You have the stories you want to tell, and then you're dependent on photographs that vineyards are giving you to tell that story. And you need one that doesn't look like an advertisement, and you need it to be the right time of the year. And then once you have that story, it needed to work sequentially with your other stories in the book. And so we were constantly, looking and editing for visual story flow along with content story flow. And every so often we'd think the book was set, and we'd realize, oh no, this looks like there's no leaves on the vine here. We can't put this here, and then we'd have to recalibrate. So it was just that there were so many puzzle pieces to put together.
I love that, the behind the scenes of such a visual book. So approximately how many photos were you and Bob considering for the book, and how many ended up being in the book?
There's thousands of photographs.
Thousands? Wow.
Because sometimes vineyards were so generous and just said, okay, here's our library, look. And that could be thousands in and of itself. The book is 180 pages. 160 of those are what we call them spreads, because they're double-page stories. And I would say in there, there's probably 200, maybe more photographs.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot of curation. Holy smokes. You know what I love too, Sophie, because I'm drawn to your writing, your words, but I loved how your text always seemed nestled inside a vineyard or the picture. Like it was just, I love that I could see still sort of transparently through the background, the picture still sort of haunting in the back of your text. It was lovely.
Every time I wrote something and then Bob put it in the spread with the background, I had to rewrite it because it was a conversation with the picture,
Right.
And so what was important to lead with maybe wasn't so important to lead with once you saw it in context. So everything got written and then rewritten to be, Bob calls them visual poems, but because he's really an artist, and he has worked in that medium with words and images, and as standing works of art. But that's how each page really had to work. It's a fully integrated thought between the background painting, the words, and the picture. So thank you very much for picking up on that. That's meaningful.
Oh, yeah. I love that. Well, it goes in parallel with a phrase. You have so many beautiful phrases in this book, but you say the vine is a dance with the natural world. Well, your text was a dance with the other elements in this book, which was just lovely. They were all sort of not rotating, evolving, weaving, whatever, around each other, which is just marvelous.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So based on, writing this, what are the biggest changes and trends that are happening in the vineyard that you observed in putting this book together, especially those that might surprise us?
Yeah, I think the biggest trend is when I started writing about wine, the conversation was, do you move to organics? Do you move to biodynamics? I mean, at that time, the question of, I have a belief that the wine world is always a kind of generation behind the food world and what it's taking on. And so organics were very, very important in food, but maybe not so understood in wine because people didn't think that wine was good for you. And so why would you care? But as time went on, there was an understanding that, wine is farming, we're ingesting whatever's being put in the vineyard and larger ecological concerns. But still, the question was considered in a traditional or a conventional paradigm where are you going to no longer use chemical inputs in the vineyard, but really use organic or biodynamic inputs in the vineyard. And now it's interesting to me, like if you look at other forms of conservation, there's an understanding that a protected area doesn't end at its borders. It's integrated with whatever's happening at its borders, and a vineyard is the same thing. It's part of an environment, and so when people start to talk about regenerative agriculture, they're really talking about building an integrated environment. And I've come to prefer to use an expression, natural resilience, because it's not something that's been codified, and I think everybody does it on their in their own way, but building natural resilience into vineyards where they're taking care of themselves in connection with trees and grasses and cover crops and water sources and biodiversity, that's the most important change. And that's why if you go and you listen to even top Bordeaux producers, they'll say for the first time, these formal Bordeaux vineyards are beginning to look like English gardens because they need flowers and they need trees and they can measure, their health by bee activity. And this is the most important thing for vineyards right now, is that there's nothing more dangerous than a monoculture. It's just very vulnerable. And
and not good for the environment either, like the soil or whatever. But nice segue, Sophie. Speaking of English gardens, yes, absolutely, great way to put it. Yeah. The legendary British wine author Hugh Johnson writes the foreword to your book, which is quite an endorsement. How did you convince him to do that? I'm asking for a friend, of course.
Of course. Yeah, this is tenacity. He is friendly with the one of my local Burgundy specialists, John Truax, who's been a champion of my book from the very early days. And every time he came to Flatiron Wines to promote his latest edition of the Pocketbook to Wine, the Pocket Guide to Wine, I would bring drafts of my book and show it to him. And the first time I went, I brought a copy of his gardening book because, and I got him to sign it. And we always wanted him to write about the vineyard as a garden, which is his favorite subject, he told me. And if you want, and after a while, and I think when a really wonderful publisher came on board and he knew that this was going to be done well and the story spoke to things that he cared about, he said yes. And it was a pinch myself kind of moment, and he is so generous and such a great writer. And it was an act of enormous generosity because he really doesn't know me. He just liked the work and what the work was about, and had been tracking it for a number of years.
That's amazing. Well done and well deserved. So you've said he's an avid gardener, and he compares vineyards to gardens. We've touched on this a little bit, but in what surprising ways are vineyards like gardens?
I think they are gardens.
They are gardens, not like gardens. They are gardens. Good.
They are gardens, except that the point isn't, the vineyard isn't the end point. The fruit, you're growing fruit to make wine, right? So there's an aesthetic vision, not in the look of your vineyard, but how you're managing your vineyard to grow fruit that will make wine that expresses your vision. So that's how it's different. But otherwise, you're tending the soil, you're pruning, you're thinking about it in 4 seasons. I mean, it's very much like a garden.
Yeah, and as I know people call them different things, like wine growers. I still find that an awkward phrase, but it's probably closer to the truth. But viticulturalists, winemakers, they are increasingly focused on smaller and smaller plots to differentiate different bottles or different wines. So it does get to be that sort of intimate garden feel as people get more specific about expressing terroir, or that fancy French term of soil and climate and winemaking decisions. But you note in the book that the origin of the word viticulture, to cultivate the land, and that it is like an installation, a la Bob Chaplin. Do you view a well-cared vineyard as kind of like Eden, like a kind of a vision of utopia or something like that?
That's a really good question. I think let me think about that for a second.
Sure.
A well cared for vineyard can be like Eden because it doesn't need anything else, right? It's complete. There's nothing. There's no disguises, right? It's not a state of nature because it's cultivation. So there is man's hand in it, and that's different than Eden, right? Because there is obviously, to an extent, a manipulation, but when it's at its best, the manipulation is working with nature and not dominating or changing nature. So I think there's a yes and no to that. It's not, a garden is not, a vineyard is not a state of nature per se, because it is cultivated. There is a human hand. But when the hand is light, I think there is an Eden-like quality.
I like that. Very nuanced. And especially if the hand is not light, we can always consider expulsion from Eden. But that's a whole other story.
Exactly.
In the book, you observe that winemakers need to hold an aesthetic vision. What do you mean by that?
I mean, we use interchangeably the French term vigneron and wine grower for that, because it's the best English equivalent we could find, even if it's an imperfect and sometimes clunky word. But that's what they're doing. They're kind of growing the kind of wine they want to produce, and so every choice they make is with, what kind of wine do I want to make? You know, what would be the best kind of wine to make from this place, from this plot of land, with this climate, with my cultural heritage, with the cultural heritage of the place where I'm growing wine. So that is an aesthetic vision. You can't control it 100%. There's weather or vintage, but there's always choices that are being made. That was also another surprising story that I didn't understand very well until writing this book. That winter pruning is a reflective time. That's when you really think about what's happened in the past vintages and what you want to happen in the vintages to come, and you make choices about the shape of your vine because you have an aesthetic vision and then also an experience, just a practical farming experience about what's going to work. And those are small changes because you don't want to shock the vine, but these are directional choices that vignerons make every year.
That's fascinating. It's very meditative, almost contemplative, like the seasons in your own life. Sometimes it's a busy writing a book, you kind of hibernate for a while, research, write, whatever. And now your season is to be out there in the public promoting it. So right. I don't know if you want to call that harvest or whatever, but yeah, it does parallel our lives. We have
bottled and shipped.
Yeah, that's right. It's on the shelves now, folks, so yeah. Pick it up. No worries about that. All right. So, and then you have another lovely phrase. What does it mean to live close to the earth? Is it just paying attention, or what do you mean, especially in the context of the vineyard or the wine growing, winemaking?
I think that's a certain amount of attentiveness that's really important in wine growing and winemaking. And I also think wine drinking, I think what got me really interested in wine is just the way it brings you into your senses, makes you pay attention. You're looking at color and scent and taste and length. You're very kind of sensitized when you're really paying attention and drinking wine. And it's the same thing in making wine in the vineyard. You're looking at the ground in a different way. You're aware of what's happening beneath the earth and how active, and there are many times more organisms beneath the earth than there are above the earth. And so there is a way of being more tuned in, not just from being a wine grower, but from understanding how wine is grown. You become more aware of how things are interconnected and why.
Wow, living more fully. I love, again, your expression, brings you into your senses. That's a lovely way to put it. So why do many wineries these days plant roses at the end of each vineyard row? They look very pretty, but they have a more important purpose, right?
Yeah, roses are so sensitive, and so anything that's going to happen in the vineyard, any negative mildew or pest that appears, will show up on your rose first. And so you can't be in every vine row, at every vine, at every time, but they're like that proverbial canary in the coal mine, that if you plant roses at the end, in most cases you're be given a warning about what's happening deeper inside the rose.
And then you can apply treatments or whatever that might be done to fix the situation before it takes over the vines.
Exactly.
And you also note that many wineries plant a variety of cover crops like clover between the rows to increase biodiversity in the vineyard. You also had something fascinating. Each plant species can attract up to 10, maybe more different types of insects and butterflies. So why is this biodiversity important to vine health?
Biodiversity is important for resilience. You know, when you have biodiversity, you have more different species of birds, more different species of insects, you know, so you'll have natural predators for invasive insects. You'll have better soil health with fixing nitrogen, which is good for amino acids, which build the cells in the plants. It just makes for a more resilient vineyard. And the person whose quote that was the wine grower from a vineyard in Switzerland called Mytopia, and his vineyard is really like an installation, a work of installation art. And he has so much biodiversity. It's built to be an example of biodiversity. He has tomato plants in the middle and different flower corridors. And he said that he has half the species of butterflies in Switzerland are in his vineyard.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful thought.
Oh my God, that would be like walking through Eden, all these little butterflies. And now you mentioned fixing nitrogen. Sometimes, or I think you mentioned mustard plants between vineyard rows also fix nitrogen. What does it mean, fixing nitrogen? Is it just making sure that nitrogen stays in the soil? And why is that important for vines?
You know, as I said, right, it will bring nitrogen into the soil, and that is taken up through the root system, through water, through the water in the root system, and the nitrogen is part of building amino acids that are part of building the proteins that build the cellular structure in a plant.
Yeah, in us too.
In us too, exactly.
And how does scattering the ash of burned vine canes, the ones that have sort of gone gray dead, help the vineyard?
It's a kind of fertilizer.
Okay.
The same way volcanic ash is really very fertile. It's the same thing. It's a lot. Composting is putting, everything but the juice back into the soil. The burning of these ashes does the same thing. I believe. I could stand to be corrected on that one, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Now, we've heard of biodynamic preparations that some wineries use, stinging nettle tea, you've mentioned chamomile tea, mixtures in cow horns, and they're following the teachings or writings of Rudolf Steiner, I think it was.
Definitely.
Okay. What's your opinion on the efficacy of these treatments? I know you're not a viticulturalist, but what do you think? What's happening? Why are they using this, and do you think it makes a difference?
I think it makes a difference, but I think people use this system because they see that it works. The people I've spoken to have started following it very, very strictly, and then adapted to their own vineyard and what works. But it's a holistic system. Rudolf Steiner started writing when after the early industrialization period, and after reg factories were industrialized, farms started to be industrialized, and the idea was to treat the farm more holistically, almost like you would holistically like a human being, and to bring it down to a human endeavor, or back to a more humanistic endeavor. And so these kind of preparations, if you put them in a big commercial tradition, vineyard that was used to using chemical additives or something, I don't think they would work, right?
Okay.
But it takes 3 years to bring a vineyard organic. It takes 3 years to bring it, more years to bring it biodynamic from there. So you have these very sensitive systems that are biodiverse, and they're responsive at that point to these kinds of treatment, and it requires a much more intimate kind of the hand farming that it requires a lot more walking through the vineyards with these copper spray cans. So there's just more awareness. Again, it's a closer to the earth kind of farming. So I'm not a scientist, and I only know what I know, and I'm not a wine grower myself, so I only know what I know from reading and talking and tasting. But a lot of very smart people, very scientifically minded people who are watching and looking empirically at what's happened in their own vineyards, are very committed to this. And for a long, now people talk about it, but for a long time there are a lot of wineries who you wouldn't expect to be biodynamic, and they kept it very quiet because it sounded too green for their brand. But now it's a mark of care and environmental care, and I think there's more disclosure around it. So I believe it works. I know there's absolutely people who would think differently, perhaps, because it can seem a little bit esoteric, but I think it does work.
Yeah, I think we're past it's too mushy woo-woo or whatever. And, if anything, like you say, at least it's making wine growers pay closer attention. Even if it's a placebo effect, the fact you're paying more attention to your vines and getting them off drugs, so to speak, right. Detoxing them off of synthetic chemicals, I think that has to be a good thing for both the vines and the environment.
Definitely.
You talk about the cosmic pull on the vine, so we always acknowledge the sun and how it ripens the grapes, but I want to make sure I was understanding this correctly because I found it fascinating. The moon's gravitational pull draws the sap up from the roots and into the vines. Is that when it's ideal to prune the vines, or do you want to prune them when the sap falls down? And why is that?
Okay. So this is all the very eloquent words of Alois Clemens Laugater, and they are great proponents. The Laugater family are great proponents of biodynamic farming and explain this so beautifully. And if you can think about the way they explained it to me, the way Clemens explained it to me, is it's like a microtide in the plant, because sap is water and nutrients. And so when the moon is closer to the earth, the sap is going to be drawn up into the up the vine and into the branches. When the moon's further away, it's more likely to be closer to the roots, just like in the ocean. And so that there's not one better time for pruning. It's just being conscious of, again, these are very, very small adjustments, but if you have a plant that was too vigorous, you might prune it when the sap is in the vines to calm it down a little bit. If you have a plant that really needs more energy, you would choose to prune when the moon is further away and the sap is more in the root system, so that you don't divert or sap it, for lack of a better word, of its of its strength and vitality.
That makes so much sense. And we've talked about this, pruning, pruning happens at different times of the year and different parts of the plant, but shoot thinning is like altering the vascular system of the vine, which is a wonderful way to put it. And you said it's a highly technical skill. What could go wrong? You talk about progressive branching and building the vine architecture or lymphatic system. I loved all these comparisons.
Yeah. Well, these are the words of Marco Simonit, who is a master pruner who's been very attentive to vine development and vine architecture, and he trains people. Many of the vineyards in the book, not just the one featured on the features on Marco Simonit, work with him. And he has these two punctuation points where he really trains. He works a lot with vineyard crews and with the viticultural managers of each of the vineyards and the wine growers, and so spring pruning or shoot thinning and winter pruning, they're they bookend each other, because you're really creating the morphology of the plant, and and that way hopefully all the plants in the vineyard will ripen, will flower at the same time, and then you'll develop fruit at the same time, and then hopefully ripen at the same time for an even harvest. And if you think about a plant as an organism, if you keep cutting in a way that blocks the flow of the sap, right? So instead of having a highway, maybe you're on the back roads and winding around, and you kind of it has to migrate around a wound, to get up into the vine. Your vine's not going to live as long. It's not going to produce as much fruit. It's not going to express its sense of place as well. So if you do spring pruning and winter pruning with while being conscious of the architecture of the plant and how sap travels in the interior of the plant, you're going to have a healthier plant with more longevity that's going to better express sense of place. And so it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Never got into that. I loved learning about that. All right, off to our bat houses in Portugal. What are they doing there?
They're not just in Portugal. They're everywhere. They're in Bordeaux. This is the story that we chose to tell about bat houses.
Yeah.
Bats eat insects. So lots of vineyards are finding ways to bring bats into the vineyard at night. Each bat could eat like 1,300 bugs in a night.
Wow.
It reduces the need for insecticide. And so it's not just the bat houses. There's because bats travel using sonar senses.
So there's an Airbnb bat.
Exactly.
You're saying.
but they will build. Actually, there's a vineyard in Bordeaux that built paths of trees straight up to the vineyard, planted, so that then the next highest physical object was the vine, so they would drop down, and so a lot of vineyards are cultivating ways to bring bats into the vineyard to take care of invasive insects, so that they don't need to spray.
Wow. And this winery in Portugal, though, they built like 100 bat houses all among the vineyards. These little things on a tall pole, looking like sort of like bird houses, but bat houses, I guess. That's great. Bat condominiums. It's just caught my attention. What about the pigs in another region? I can't remember how many there were.
That was in Beretta. It was Felipa Pato, and she and her husband William Wouters have a vineyard there, and they're biodynamic producers. Apparently, suckling pig is a delicacy that the area is known for, so they thought, well, we're supposed to use local plants and local vines and, for cover crops, and we're growing, indigenous local varieties, why not use local animals? And pigs, it turns out, they root with their snouts, and so it's perfect for planting cover crops, because when it's moist, they turn the earth, and when it's dry, they also early in the season turn the earth, and they can't get down that far. They only get down about 10 centimeters, and so they don't affect the root system. So they've become great plant companions.
That's great.
Yeah.
And I love the picture, or the visual picture of them sleeping as a little group under a tree.
Yes.
Is that what they do?
Right. They built them houses, and but they didn't want to sleep there. They wanted to sleep together under the 100-year-old vines or under the olive trees. And this was a great story, and this was like a little bit of the serendipity of the project, where at one point we were looking for a picture of hail, and we couldn't find a picture of hail that said what we wanted to say. And we wanted to suggest hail maybe more than just show utter destruction. And then we found this photograph by a beautiful photographer, John Wyand, and we contacted him online and spoke to him, and then he was just incredibly generous with his photography for the project. And we used his photograph of storms, of a woman in a vineyard seeing a storm coming. But as he was asking us what else we needed, he showed us this picture of the pigs and introduced us to the winemaker. And that's how this story came in. That's just so full of charm.
It is.
And
those pigs are adorable. Pigs can be adorable. It's a great picture.
So cute, yeah. and really for me also discovering such a great winemaker. She's so talented, and the wines are excellent.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right, we've got one more animal stop to go here. Bonterra in California, which well-known organic and biodynamic, or organic perhaps, has 3,000 sheep. They're biodynamic as well. Wow. So they have 3,000 sheep. So what are the sheep doing? Why didn't they hire pigs?
Well, the pigs are very specialized. But the sheep do more and more. That was so interesting in this interview. They brought the sheep in, as many people do, to graze, before and after the harvest, and they graze and they leave fertilizer, through naturally. And they found the more they would rotate the sheep through the vineyards, which is so interesting to use them at scale in this way. And then the longer they were around, the more they found for them to do. So they do clearing of potential fire hazards. They
Land mowers.
Land mowers,
Sorry.
exactly. If there's dangerous places to clear grasses that they need to, say on the faces of dams, they use the sheep for that. They bring them down to the Russian River and have them get rid of invasive grasses, so that the longer the sheep have been integrated into the vineyard, the more and more they do get integrated into the vineyard. And then they told me this funny story, because when they first had the sheep, the only problem was kind of the herd mentality. So if one sheep took off in a particular direction, they all might follow and run. And at first, the drip irrigation was lower, and they would invariably take out a row of drip irrigation. So they had to redesign the drip irrigation to have the fruiting wire a little higher and the drip irrigation a little higher, so that there was room, when the sheep wanted to run, there was room for them to run in the vineyards.
That's great. Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, reducing their environmental hoofprint, I assume.
Exactly. You don't. Exactly.
I can't resist. Anyway, okay. Why did one winery decide to plant vines in concentric circles rather than the traditional rows?
Well, that also goes to hoof prints.
Yes.
They started working with horses in the vineyard to have less compaction than a tractor, and also to bring the animal element in. And if you think about it, concentric circles are much easier when you have a horse-drawn plow than you would if you had to go to the end of the row and then turn around and come back. So
right.
There is that contiguous circle. I think there's also like energy and vortex and kind of some mystical elements to it, like you would see those kinds of shapes in other cultures. But on the very practical reason, if you have a horse-drawn plow, it's a really nice, smooth way for taking the animal through the vineyard.
Yeah, it's great. And you talk about compaction. Of course, how compacted the soil gets from the horse is going to be far less than a machine, a tractor, or whatever. So it's very good for aeration of the soil and not getting plowed down so much.
Exactly.
In the book, you observe that grapevines are self-pollinating. How does that happen without assistance from bees? Or we're going to have a birds and a bees discussion without the birds and the bees, but what's happening with the grapevine?
So it has the stamen and the pollen within the flower. So that's
Okay.
why you don't want. That's why when we talked about Olivier Leflevre, and he said the thing you don't want is a wet flowering, because once the vines flower and they open, the stamen and the pollen are both in the vine flower. So what you want is that fertilization to happen once the flowers open. That's my understanding.
Okay.
So that they're what you would call, self-pollinating or hermaphroditic, actually, because it has all the elements it needs for creating fruit within the flower.
And if it's wet, they don't sort of connect two
exactly
pieces.
You can imagine, okay. Right? Like the wet pollen might not float in the air with a little breeze. That might not right. happen in the same way.
Gotcha. Okay.
It might get washed away.
Yeah. You have, again, more beautiful phrases in the book, such as the cycle of the vine capturing the sun's energy. It's lovely. You know what that reminded me of, Sophie, was Monet, one of the Impressionist painters, would take the same subject over and over and just paint it in different types of light. Like he did one wall 19 times, one with like morning bright white light and then, amber tones of the afternoon, then blue light. Do you see similarities with wine growers studying the light? I mean, surely they're focused on the sun and so on, but any other observations there?
Oh, light is incredibly important in wine growing. How much light, the intensity of the light. And when I really had the honor of walking with Chris Howell on Spring Mountain, which 85% of Cain Vineyard and Winery was burnt down in the glass fire, and so he was in the process of replanting. And
sorry, for those who don't know, where is this located?
Oh, sorry, this is in the Napa Valley.
Right. Okay.
And so, Chris is a great Francophile and was really, inspired by the wines of Burgundy. And so he used to have beautiful Guillot trellising with full exposure for the vines and for the fruit. But now that he's replanting, he really understands in California's Mediterranean climate, what you really need is dappled light to grow beautiful fruit. And so he's changed the architecture of the vineyard, where they're on these terraces, and instead of 2 rows per terrace, there's 1 row, so that the vine the canopy can kind of arch out and allow just the right amount of light in, because controlling the light is really very important to the speed and of the development of the fruit.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Another phrase, crystalline or crystalline cathedrals. What were you describing there?
So I once had the pleasure of sitting next to Christian Moreau at a Chablis lunch, and he showed me this picture, the one that's in the book, that he had taken of his vineyard. And it happens before bud burst. It's called, well, let me back up. To protect vines from frost, and buds particularly from frost, which could damage the whole harvest before it even gets going, in Chablis they use something called aspersion. And this means that the second it turns 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, they start to run sprinklers. And they keep running the sprinklers until the temperature rises and the ice begins to melt. Because what happens is that the sprinklers, the water freezes around the buds, creating a cocoon where it stays 0 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature doesn't change, so that you don't lose the bud to frost.
Wow.
But when you look at it, speaking of light, you see that kind of winter sun reflecting off these long strips of ice, and it is like a crystalline cathedral. I mean, it's just magnificent to look at. We have a picture in the book with this explanation. It's really beautiful, almost otherworldly.
Lovely. Yeah, lovely turn of phrase as well. And So, well, speaking of bud break, it is a very vulnerable time, and especially since an early frost can cause a lot of damage. In BC, for example, they've lost 97% of this year's crop. I wonder if that would have helped them, or if that's something they can do in future years. Even infrared photos of these buds show that they're black to the core, and that's going to take years to recover. Like, it doesn't just pop back next year. So another way that some wineries fight this extreme cold is with smudge pots. What's their purpose? I guess it's just to circulate warmer air in the vineyard, but then again, you say they're moving away from smudge pots to different methods as well.
Right. I mean, they do warm the vineyard. They bring heat to the ground of the vineyard. People are moving away from them just because you're burning kerosene in the vineyard, and it's bad for the environment. But it's also a very traditional way. It's still used. It's effective. It's just not the best for the environment.
Sure. Now they're increasingly using wind machines, right?
Mm-hmm. Wind machines.
To get the warmer air down.
Exactly.
Yeah. Another lovely phrase, fog is the visualization of cold air. How does fog help vineyards, especially in Napa and Sonoma?
Well, this was also Chris Howell explaining this to me. So the fog comes in from San Francisco Bay, into the Napa Valley, and at night it condenses as the air grows colder, and it sits on the valley floor, and it cools the fruit after being in the hot sun all day. So it essentially arrests the development of the fruit. So you have these bursts of ripening followed by a cooling, followed by, and then as the air warms, the fog goes up the, up the mountainside. So actually, it's why it creates what they call an inversion, because it cools the mountain vineyards in, during the day. So that what you have in the mountains in Napa is this kind of continuous, more moderated temperatures, because you have the cooler evenings and then the cooler days from the inversion created by the fog traveling up the hillsides. So you have two very beautiful expressions of Cabernet Sauvignon, just slightly different characteristics for having different ripening patterns, even though they're so close to each other.
Yeah, and the photos of the fog on the vineyards are just magnificent in the book as well.
They're extraordinary. We're grateful to them for sharing those photos with us.
Yeah. What is massel selection? Is that the vine cane pruning? Am I treading back on what we've already talked about?
No,
Some of these technical terms?
That's exactly what it is. So in a place like Lafarge in Volnay, around the harvest, right before they'll go around and they'll look at all their vines, and the ones that they want to replicate, that they think are really thriving in their environment, they will go and they'll put a blue ribbon on it. And then when it comes time for winter pruning, they will take a branch from that vine to cultivate, to graft on to rootstock later on. And that's the advantages of that, is that you have vines that are highly adaptive to your particular place. They've been speaking with the environment and the other plants and trading information. So you're not kind of using clones that you're bringing in. So you're likely to have a higher success rate, and you also might have a more distinctive wine. And I think that's the idea, because it's something that's been cultivated specifically with your piece of land, in this case for generations.
Great. You describe harvest poetically as the death of the vine, the birth of the wine.
Right.
I love the picture of the grape harvester in the Moselle region of Germany carrying a massive basket on his back. What's happening there?
I want to back up, because that's Franz Weniger's line. And I love that line. And when he said it, I was like, oh, that's the opening of the harvest section. What a great turn
absolutely.
of phrase. So in the Moselle, as you know, there's different levels of German wines, particularly Rieslings, are categorized by their level of sugar ripeness. And so they will harvest in tries. First the dry wines, the Cabernet wines, and then the Spätlese wines, and then the Bier and Auslese wines. And so as it gets later and later in the season, it gets colder and probably a little damper, and these are really steep slopes. And so this is a picture of a harvester climbing those steep slopes with a basket on his back, harvesting, really doing the very hard work of harvesting the Riesling, this very special wine from the Moselle.
Yeah, the basket almost seems as big as he is.
Yeah.
And some of them have to pick lying down. The slopes are so steep.
Right, and slick. Exactly.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
That just sounds like a
Right.
Mission Impossible kind of.
Right.
Wow.
The winemaker said that Riesling vines like cold feet and a warm head.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Have you discovered anything new that you would add to an updated edition? I know it's just out, so we're probably not there yet, but is there anything?
We just got limited by the number of pages, so there are stories we had to leave out. We would have loved to have gone more deeply into trellising, and then there's some wineries like Espareo had a vineyard that was just an experimental vineyard, trying all different kinds of grape varieties to see what might work. And so we had a story about what happened to vineyards that are left untended, that were interesting too. So not necessarily. So it's the stories that got left on the floor because we ran out of pages, more so
Sure.
than something new at this point, at least.
Excellent. So, lightning round. This has gone so quickly. I love this conversation. But in the Museum of Sophie Menin, what 3 objects would be in the central display?
Well, there would be my universal wine glass from Zalto, which I love. There would be my yoga mat, which I can't live without.
Good. Okay.
Oh, and there would be my computer, which I think may be my third arm. Which I always seem to be attached to. Yeah.
Absolutely. Agree.
Yeah.
Tell us about your favorite childhood food and what wine you'd pair with it.
Oh, that's a good question. I loved carrot cake as a child.
Me too.
And so I happen to love Moscato d'Asti. I love the kind of almond flavors, especially when it's well done, and it's so light in alcohol. It's like 5 or 6%. So at the end of a meal, if you just want something delicious and sparkling, and I think it might be carrot cake and Moscato d'Asti.
I am going to have to try that this weekend. I mean, carrot cake's my favorite, but that's a brilliant pairing. I love that. It's got a bit of spritz, just a bit of sweetness.
Yeah.
I don't know if your favorite wine gadget is your Zalto glass, but would that be it, or do you have something else?
I do have something. Well, I guess it might be my Zalto glass, but I also happen to love my foil cutter. Because it keeps me from cutting my fingers, and it helps me open wines more gracefully in front of guests. And so, it's one of those simple,
make a clean cut.
Right, dollar things that can make all the difference.
Is there a particular brand or just any coil cutter?
Just any foil cutter. This looks like it was a gift from a wine store. My other gadget, I think, would be my cave.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, because
fridge.
I think
wine fridge.
Well, yeah, because temperature is so important to tasting the fruit, both in red and white wines, and so I can't speak enough to red wines need to be cool enough to taste the fruit, and white wines need to be warm enough to taste the fruit. That the differentiation from where you might have the most enjoyable experience is much more narrow than you might think.
Absolutely. If you could share a bottle of wine out with any person outside the wine world, living or dead, who would that be, and which bottle would you open?
Oh, outside the wine world. Oh, that's interesting. Well, I don't know. Could Alice Waters be outside the wine world?
Yes.
Okay.
She qualifies. Yes. We'll let that in. Yes.
Okay. I would love to drink a glass of Domaine Tempier with Alice Waters because, I wrote this piece for the Daily Beast about how she learned to cook there. And so that feels like such an important spot for understanding how we eat and drink now, this kind of Alice Waters' relationship with Lulu Payard and Domaine Tempier. So I would love to hear more about that.
Me too. And of course, she was in Berkeley. She had a famous restaurant. I don't know if it's still open.
I think it is still open.
Still. Okay. All fresh produce and so on. And of course, her sort of companion in wine crime would be Kermit Lynch, who kind of celebrated Domaine Tempier, I think it was, in his book Adventures on the Wine Route. Yeah, the rosé especially. But the two of them, great pairing. You could invite Kermit too if you want. I said outside the wine world, but another exception. You could invite Kermit.
That would be such a pleasure then.
Wow, the time. Is there anything we haven't covered, Sophie, that you'd like to mention?
No, we covered it earlier, but just that I couldn't have done this without my co-author, Bob Chaplin. That it's been a great collaboration, and that was such a pleasure. And I have to make sure in an interview like this that he gets the acknowledgement that he more than deserves.
Excellent. All right, hold up that book again. We're going to put it in the show notes, A Year in the Vineyard. Yeah. I expect it's available wherever you can buy books, online, in book retailers. Is there anything else you want to mention about where people can get it?
Sure. I mean, you can get it at Amazon or, Barnes & Noble, whatever your preferred retailer is. If you can't find it there within the week, you could find it on my site, sophiemenin.com, and I'll send one to you directly. So
okay, that sounds great. Wow. Well, congratulations again, Sophie. This is a wonderful achievement you and Bob have put together, and the photos are stunning. In an interview like this, of course, we focused on the words, the text, but we'll put links in the show notes, and people can see just how gorgeous it is. You sent me a few photos as well, and we'll include those so people can get a taste. But really, it's a book well worth buying, not just for your coffee table and friends, but to read this beautiful book. So thank you, Sophie, for joining me here today. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Oh, it's really been my pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Well, don't log off, but I'll say goodbye for now, and look forward to connecting with you, perhaps in person sometime for a glass of wine.
I would love that.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.